Thank you for attending our webinar today. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and available on our website later this week at www.trustpointinc.com. Keep in mind, we have a number of webinars available on our website and additional tools and resources. We appreciate those of you who have already submitted questions regarding understanding 401k fees. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to answer your questions at the end of the meeting. I'm Lisa Meyer. I am the lead of the Retirement Plan Services Group, and I am joined with Jason Munns. He is the Vice President of Development at TrustPoint. On our agenda today, we are going to discuss the Department of Labor disclosure requirements for plan sponsors and participants. We'll discuss those that get paid. So who are those people that get paid for working with the retirement plan? And then we will discuss mutual funds and the different expenses that could be paid through using the expense ratios of the mutual funds. Before we begin, a little bit about TrustPoint. So TrustPoint has been in business for over 100 years. We were established in 1913 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We also have offices in Minneapolis and Eau Claire. We have over 1,100 client relationships, 3,500 separate accounts, and over $5 billion in assets under management. We have a number of services available. Our retirement plan services are a comprehensive solution for plan sponsors. We provide record keeping, administration, education, investment management, and we also work with the auditors if you happen to have an audited plan that requires the audit each year. We also provide trust and estate administration. We work with individuals, businesses, and family offices on investment management, and we work with foundations and nonprofits. So the plan sponsor fee disclosure is called the 408B2, and this must be provided to the plan sponsor when your account is set up. Or if you've had the same provider for several years, then most likely you have a 408B2 that you received in 2012. There's a number of items that must be disclosed on the 408B2. The service providers, so all of those service providers that work with your 401k plan, whether it's record keeper, TPA, investment management, trustee, all the providers should be listed on a 408B2 and the fees that they charge. There should also be an acknowledgement of fiduciary services that are available for you, and all direct and indirect compensation. By indirect compensation, that could be compensation received by the record keeper or the advisor from the mutual fund investment offerings in the plan. There's also record keeping services which must be disclosed. So the portion of the overall expenses that goes to the record keeper should be available in the 408B2. The participant fee disclosure is called a 404A1A, and this is available to participants in the plan every year. So this is a notice that they receive annually. There are two main sections to the fee disclosure. There's plan-related information, and this is where you can find general information about the plan, on the fees associated with it, the record-keeping fees, base fee, administration, and any individual expenses such as distributions, quadros, or loans. The second part of the fee disclosure covers investment-related information. So this will cover performance, expense ratios, and the investment benchmarks as well. So a lot of information available. You can also access additional information, which would be a website that would be provided in the fee disclosure along with a glossary of terms. Keep in mind that the format of the fee disclosure should be very similar regardless of what plan you have. So it should be comparative format that would be available so that a participant can compare the fee schedules from different 401k plans if they have multiple plans. who gets paid for the 401k plan? Well, there are a number of providers for the 401k plan. So there's a mutual fund company, and this is the investment provider for the plan. And usually there's several investment options available from several different mutual fund companies. And based on the assets invested in the plan, the mutual fund company will be compensated. There's also generally an investment manager, broker, or advisor on the plan, a third-party administrator, and a record keeper. And sometimes that can be the same group that offers the TPA work and record keeping. And there's also a trustee that would get paid as well.
One of the first questions we got to ask ourselves is, at least had indicated, there are really the four main places that are going to be getting paid here. The first one, the mutual fund companies, we have to understand and identify, well, why are we using mutual funds in the first place? So 99.9% of all investment options that are within a 401k plan are going to be mutual funds or something very similar to that. The reason we use, and the reason that the DOL and all the regulators like mutual funds, is they do provide a fair amount of diversification, and this would be an alternative to picking individual stocks. So each individual mutual fund does have professional managers, so there are people within those mutual funds that specialize and look at these every day, and typically they're looking and they're playing within certain sandboxes. So one may be looking at just international, whereas another may be looking at just small cap. And also, because you're pooling these large amount of assets together into one investment product, they often can provide a much lower cost than if you were to try to go out and pick those individual stocks yourself and incur any of those trading costs. Mutual funds also have a great amount of liquidity, so people can trade in and out of them on a daily basis. And then the DOL also then and says that the qualified default investment alternative mutual funds are approved QDIAs. So you may have heard that when you work with your plan provider on what is the default alternative if somebody hasn't selected that. And often that's either a balanced or a target date mutual fund that is fitting for the age of the participants. Now, there are over 9,000 of these individual mutual funds within the world of mutual funds. So there's a lot of options too, which is another advantage to why you see and why people use these in 401k plans. The next part of that is you may have heard of different mutual funds being called either passive or active. So the other way to look at this is managed versus an index. So everybody is very familiar with the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ. These are just three big indexes. So what that means is there are a list of investments or a list of companies that are in that index, and you are buying, a lot of times, think of it as an equal share, although there is some differences there, and there are some index funds that act a little different. Think of it as you're buying each of those with no regard for which one you think is going to do better than the next. An active or managed mutual fund is going to have people behind the scenes or investment experts behind the scenes that are going to choose the investments or the companies within each of those mutual funds that they think is going to do better than others. So this is where you have people picking stocks within that because they think one's going to do better in certain environments or certain economic conditions. Because of this, because you have people involved on the managed side that are actively you're paying people for their expertise versus a passive where you're really just buying all of these investments in all of these companies. Managed or active funds tend to be much more expensive than index or passive funds. So that's another thing to look at when you're putting your plan together. We believe you should have a good combination of both. It does make sense, but if somebody was going to give you a fee comparison, you also have to realize that that fee is controlled by how each individual participant is investing. So that individual participant is going to decide whether or not he or she would want index versus active funds. And that he or she is then making the decision on what they want to pay for that and should be taking that into consideration. So a lot of times that isn't necessarily weighed as heavily on the plan provider, but we will get into where it gets a little in the weeds. We'll get a little in the weeds and show you where it gets a little hard to distinguish a little sometimes. So within mutual funds, even all mutual funds, almost all of them will sell different share classes. So a lot of times you will see an A share or a B share, C share, an I share, or R share. These are all this is it's the same investments, the same expertise that you're buying within that mutual fund, investing in the same things. That company, that mutual fund company, is just packaging it differently and selling it differently to different people. So what I mean by selling it differently is typically the fees are different. And there are different reasons for that. There are a whole host of reasons of why why you would want one versus another. But typically the retail shares, the barrier for entry, so the minimums to get into those retail type shares are much lower. So, and because they're much lower, they're going to be a little higher cost. So they're going to be fairly significantly higher cost versus an institutional share class. So you have your management fee, which is kind of the base fee that it costs any person to buy into that fund. You have transaction costs where you could be incurred if you're buying and selling. Sometimes you see this as redemption fees in 401k plans, and those are fees to keep you from trading in and out because they don't want people to be trying to time the market. But there are also the most common, or the other common thing, particularly in 401k plans, that you're going to see are 12B1 fees. So 12B1 fees are a fee that is added on top of the management fee, and that fee gets paid typically to either the advisor, the investment manager, or the record keeper that is providing those fund options. So that's a way that they can get compensated. So let me break that down a little bit more and give you an illustration of what that looks like and what the benefit or the disadvantage of one over the other is. So on a retail here, you can see the retail shares that we have listed are A and C shares, and the expense ratio is what is being paid to be into that fund. So that's what you pay to play. The 0.84% on an A share is what you would pay annually, and that reduces your performance by 0.84%. But in contrast, you have an R6 share that you can buy in at 0.47%. And the biggest difference there, really all you're doing is you're getting rid of that 12B1 fee. So if you go back up to that A share, you'll see that there's 0.25%, 0.25% on a 12B1 fee. That is included as part of that 8.4. And that 0.25 then gets paid to somebody who sold the fund to you. We and others in our industry would view that it can be viewed as a conflict of interest, because if that particular fund was paying you more, or paying an advisor or an investment manager more money than another similar fund, then you have to be able to show, or somebody has to be able to show, that you're in that fund for a reason. And if it's only because if they're only in there because they're compensating the investment manager more, that's the wrong reason. And there's been a lot of litigation associated with that. So when there's this revenue sharing that's happening, that's typically a red flag, and that's something you want to pay pretty close attention to. It doesn't mean it's necessarily all bad. We have our thoughts on it and our opinions on it. We stay away from them completely. Others in the industry and with smaller plans in particular, sometimes that's really the only way you can get into some of these funds. The R6, R4, R1, a lot of times there are, particularly in the R6, there are very high minimums. So you would have to have potentially 6 figures in that investment just to be able to get that R6 share. But the way at least TrustPoint operates and some others, you can consolidate those and you can get a better deal and maybe get into that R6 share. One of the things we say, if you want to know if you're getting these 12B1 fees, if there are any revenue sharing, ask your provider to put it in writing. Ask them to put it in writing that they guarantee that there are no revenue sharing and that they're not collecting any compensation from anybody other than you. Because that's the bottom line. It's really hard to decipher when you're trying to pull out who's getting paid and which dollars are going where. So the other person that is going to get paid in this is an investment manager. So the investment management fees can be taken in a lot of ways. You already saw the 12B1 fee. So that would be where it's paid direct through the mutual fund. There's also very common to see an asset-based fee. So a lot of times this is also called a wrap fee. It can be flat or it could be tiered. So it could be on the first $1 million, it's this amount. On the next dollar amount, it's this amount, and so on and so forth. So it could be a tiered schedule, it could be a flat. Very common for us to see a flat fee there. And in some cases, you will see that listed as an asset-based fee of, say, 0.5% or 0.8% is in the example that we have coming up here. So you'll see an asset-based fee of 0.8%. That is just a fee that is taken right off of the performance of the investments. And sometimes, if we go back to this example, instead of 0.84%, you'll see it stated as 1.64%. So sometimes they will just add that wrapper onto what they call the expense ratio, and that fee's coming right out of that. So you don't actually see a line item for it. The way to check that is you would look up, in this case, American Funds Euro Pacific Growth Fund, look up the share class and look at what you're paying, what's being disclosed to you and what you're paying for an expense ratio. If there's a difference between what Yahoo or Google says you should be paying versus what you are paying, then that's a good indication that there's a revenue sharing or there's some fees that aren't being disclosed or that you need to dig into a little bit more. So that's where it would be paid directly through mutual funds. And as I mentioned, there's not always a line item for this. So on your statements, you won't necessarily see if it's getting paid directly for your through the mutual funds. 90% of the time, you won't see a line item and you won't see a fee anywhere other than digging into it, just as I explained. So you also have your record keepers. These are also the third-party administrators. That's what TPA would stand for. So your TPA or your record keepers can also be paid on these asset-based fees. So again, it could be tiered, could be flat. Not as often is this paid directly through the mutual funds, but it can be. It certainly can be. So some of that percentage, if you see a difference, could be going to your record keeper. There are also typically per participant fees. These would include things like a dollar amount every quarter for statements. There may be places that are charging you additionally for education that may be dependent on how often they're coming out. These are kind of the one-off fees, but typically you're looking at stuff that's recurring on an annual basis. The $5,500 is essentially the tax return for the 401k. You're going to have a fee typically for that. Sometimes it's included in some of these other asset-based fees and things, but typically that $5,500 fee, there is a separate fee for that. And sometimes there's, which we don't get into here, you could have a completely separate person doing that. A lot of times your TPA will prepare that, but it's, it does happen where somebody has somebody else preparing that for them. Document drafting and the amendments, those are typically one-off fees along with individual services. So individual services would be anything charged directly to a participant. This would be if you had a distribution fee. So if an individual participant wanted a distribution or if they were taking a loan, those are fees that are typically charged directly to that participant, not shared by everybody in the plan. Trustee fees are across the board. So if somebody is going to act as trustee or you're paying an entity to step in as trustee, then those trustee fees can be a flat fee on an annual basis. They can be a percentage of total assets. They could be a flat percentage. They could be a tiered percentage. A lot of times that is going to be dictated by what level of trustee they are taking on. So we don't get into trusteeship here today, but keep in mind that there are a lot of different levels of trustee, and just because somebody says they're a trustee doesn't necessarily get you maybe what you're thinking you're getting. So you have to dig into that and make sure that, are they a directed trustee? Are they a discretionary trustee, a 316 or 338? So there are all different levels of that, and there are different liabilities associated with that. And what kind of liability are you taking on as a plan provider or plan sponsor, excuse me. So to give you some rough ideas, because everybody wants to know what should I be paying for my 401k plan? Everybody wants a simple answer, right? Just a benchmark. Well, this was taken, we've got this sourced here, but the average all-in fee, if you're looking under a $2 million plan, you're somewhere between 1.2 and 2.8. You're going to be cheaper once you get over 5 million. And that's just the scale. That's just economies of scale. So typically, if your plan is greater than 5 million, your average fee is going to be somewhere between 0.93 and 1.24. If you're outside of that, if you're over 2%, I would say, regardless of your size, you should be looking at this pretty close, and you should have a pretty good answer on why that is. We talked about the 5,500, that tax return. So if you're going to look in, and one thing that I've heard and that I've heard from people is that, well, when I look at my 5,500, I don't see any expenses, so that must mean I'm not paying any fees. Well, not necessarily. A lot of times this 5,500, you are only going to see what is paid direct in the form of direct compensation. And in some of these cases, you will also see, if you dig into it, on your 5,500, you may even see where there's a difference between a direct and indirect compensation. So indirect would be you're getting paid through a mutual fund. That wouldn't necessarily be disclosed in the form of expenses. So if you see, even on the example I have here on line G, there's other expenses. Right below it's total expenses. So it says total expenses are $98,711. You're thinking, well, man, that's a lot of money. And it is, especially on a plan this size. But if you dig into 8D, 80, 8F, and 8G, the total that it makes that up, it also pulls in any sort of corrective distributions, which there shouldn't normally be any, but rollovers. So if you had somebody leave your plan and they rolled money out, on your 5,500, it's showing up as an expense of the plan. So it's really expenses, maybe a little misleading. A debit probably is a better way to look at it. So here you can see, and I have a 5,500 sample here, and I have another one, and it shows that there's $1,340. And you're thinking, man, I'm not paying hardly anything for that. Well, this is the comparison or fee illustration for the same company that has this 5,500. So when we actually dug into this for them, their total plan assets is about 1.3. It's actually two plans combined. But there was this asset management charge, this net asset fee of 0.8%, and that was a flat fee that really was getting wrapped in with any of the mutual fund expense ratios. So it's not a fee that's going to show up on your 5,500. Sometimes it's not even going to show up on a line item on your statement. So the total fund expense ratios they were paying were 0.41%, which was pretty competitive. But when you wrap in that 0.8%, it gets to be a little more expensive. They also had, then if you go down from the administrative standpoint, there are two base fees, again, because this is two plans. The record keeper fee, there's your per participant fee. So that would be for statements and that sort of things based on 80 participants. They were paying a small fee, or they were paying a fee for a 338 advisor, which is a type of fiduciary. It's not the highest level of fiduciary, but is a type of fiduciary. And then they were also paying another advisory or service provider fee that, you know, who knows where that's coming from or what that's paying for. So that's something you should be digging into. But if you're going to be looking at your own plan and really assessing how much are we paying, these are the three main categories you have to be looking at. You have to take in the total fund expense ratio or mutual fund expense ratio. And a lot of times the best way to do that is do a weighted average of all the plan assets. You have to look at, what am I paying my investment managers? Is it a tiered schedule, which was illustrated on the left? Or is it a flat fee of 0.8%? The other thing to think about there is, as this plan grows, because it's flat 0.8%, it's always going to be 0.8%. So if it's not tiered, you're not really getting any sort of benefit to grow your plan from a compensation or from a plan standpoint, from a participant. The participants aren't benefiting from the plan growing, which is typically what you would want to see. You know, the larger plans, you should get some economies of scale. You should start to see the benefit of that. And then the third one is the record keeping fees or the administration fees. So this could be a combination of, you can see here, there's the 0.02% and the 0.08%. So those are flat fees based on assets. You also have the per participant record keeping fee, and you have maybe the one-time annual fees in the form of the base fees. So once you total all that up, you can give yourself kind of an idea of where you're at for total all-in fees. And that's the best way to do your real apples to apples comparison. So our general recommendations when we're going to go through this is ask for a fee schedule and ask for fee disclosures. Lisa pointed it out earlier. There are fee disclosures that they are required to provide both you and the participants. And you should, if you don't have them, if you don't know where they're at, you should ask for them, and they should be able to provide them very quickly because it's a requirement. We would recommend that you find vendors that are 100% transparent with their fees. If you go through here and you're finding fees that you didn't know you were paying, I would say that that would be a red flag. And particularly if if your plan is set up as a self-trustee, meaning maybe you on the call are listed as a trustee, that's a personal liability to you, and it could be your liability, and it's going to be your liability if somebody has an issue with how that compensation is being received and can justify that they should have been paying less. So the full transparency just tells you that there's not going to be as much for hidden fees. I would select a fiduciary. We would recommend a discretionary trustee. So that's the highest level of trusteeship that somebody can take on. There are, again, different levels that are underneath that, but make sure you understand what level your trustee is. And then lastly, we would recommend that you look at doing what's called a bundled solution. So an all-in-one provider. This is going to create a lot of efficiencies on the administrative side, on the investment side, on the making sure everything's being done right, on the regulation side. So there's, put simply, less mouths to feed. So if you're not paying an investment manager, a record keeper, a trustee, maybe somebody do your 5,500, you're not paying all those people, there are some efficiencies to be gained, and typically those are much less. And if there's a problem with something, you know who to call for the problem. The other thing we hear a lot of times is when there's a problem, if you have multiple providers, they're all going like this. They're all saying it's that person's problem, you have to call them. No, it's that person's problem, you have to call them. So there's a lot more accountability on that end of it, a lot less work for you as the plan sponsor. Looks like we got one question, and I think we might have answered it. I think I might have answered it as I went through here. It says, how do I know it doesn't look like my investment manager is receiving any fees? How do I know that that's accurate? Lisa, do you want to cover that? I think we kind of covered that already, but.
Yeah, I think the best thing really to do is to look to see at the 408B2, because that's really going to be where it's showing all the fees for all providers. And you know, if we're happy to review any as well. So if you want us to take a look at any fee schedules, we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you all for your time, and hope you got something out of this. If you have any comments, feedback, please let us know. Otherwise, stay healthy. Take care.
Thank you.